Chapter 91. You Ting Feng, I'll have you wrapped around my finger one day. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 91. You Ting Feng, I'll have you wrapped around my finger one day. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Xiao Su stood by the door and rang the doorbell, but no one answered. Panic gripped him and he whipped out his phone. He was ready to call the police when the door creaked open. The pale, ghastly face of Yan Qingxi soon appeared. She looked like she had just walked out of the shower. Beads of water dripped from her hair as her fragile body swayed unsteadily. Xiao Su immediately rushed forward to help her. He supported her by the arm and guided her in. "Miss, are you all right? Are you having gastric problems?" Yan Qingxi ignored his question. "Do you have a cigarette? Is gents acceptable?" "Sure." Xiao Su fumbled with his pack of cigarettes and pulled out a stick for Yan Qingxi. Then, he lit the cigarette for her. While Yan Qingxi was abroad, she would smoke a cigarette whenever she had gastric. It was not an addiction, just a habit. Her death-like pallor appearance worried Xiao Su. He said, "Miss Qingxi, you don't look well. Are you feeling all right?" Yan Qingxi blew out a smoke circle and replied, "Buy me some gastric pills." Her stomach was hurting badly from the gastric. While gent cigarettes were much stronger than normal brands, it was not enough to numb the pain. "No, Mississippi. If it's hurting so much, we should go to the hospital for a check-up. I have a relative who works in the hospital, I can ask him for a favor." "We won't need to queue," Xiao Su argued. Yan Qingxi glanced at Xiao Su. After the way Yu Ting Feng had tormented her, Yan Qingxi could not turn down this kind gesture. "Okay. Then, let's go," Xiao Su said. "Sure." Yan Qingxi nodded. She went into the bathroom and changed. Xiao Su saw the marks on her neck and looked away. He kept his anger under control. Yu Ting Feng is such a horrible man. Miss Qingxi must have suffered under his hand, he thought. On the way to the hospital, Yan Qingxi had kept her eyes closed as if resting. Xiao Su could tell that she was hurting, it was the kind of pain that would wake you up. However, Yan Qingxi never let out a sound whenever she was in pain. Xiao Su thought for a while and said, "Miss Qingxi, I ran into CEO Yu downstairs just now." "Sure. He. I'm sorry. I told him about the photos that we took of Luo Jinchuan." Yan Qingxi chuckled coldly. "So, Yu Ting Feng now knows that she was the victim." No, he would never see her as a victim. A man like him would always believe that he was in the right. She made her choice when she went to flirt with Luo Jinchuan. This was simply karma. Yan Qingxi spoke slowly, "I was foolish. I thought him only as a normal man, someone I could toy with. But I forgot that that man was never in my league." The fact that Yu Ting Feng was not a man she could play like a fiddle irked her to no end. It was hard to swallow this truth. Yan Qingxi gritted her teeth. This was not the end. She would make him fall in love with her, obsessed with her even. To the point of which he could not live without her. A cruel smile was etched on her face. She had faith in her prowess. "Yu Ting Feng, I'll have you wrapped around my finger one day. Let the chips fall where they may." At the hospital, Xiao Su found his relative and quickly brought Yan Qingxi to the front of the queue. After the doctor's examination, Yan Qingxi was given some medical advice. "You shouldn't take your gastric issue lightly. If it worsens, there may be a possibility of perforation. Have scheduled meals and avoid spicy foods and alcohol." Yan Qingxi gave him a perfunctory nod. "Thank you, doctor." Chapter 92. Yan Qingxi, you are shameless. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 92. Yan Qingxi, you are shameless. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Yan Qingxi gave him a perfunctory nod. Thank you, doctor. The doctor shook his head. From the looks of it, his advice had fallen on deaf ears. The doctor prescribed a drip and some medication. After the nurse had set up an intravenous line, Xiao Su carried the 4-bag and helped Yan Qingxi up. They went out to sit in the corridor. The drip was slow, it took nearly an hour to finish the whole 4-bag. By that time, Yan Qingxi's stomach was feeling much better. In the passing hour, her mind was haunted by Yu Tingfeng's visage. That she would not let him go so easily. Even though he was out of her league, she wanted to toy with him. She had nothing to lose, so why should she be scared? Yan Qingxi was an expert in staking everything on one roll of dice. Xiao Su noticed the diminishing fluid in the 4-bag and said, "It's empty. Let me get the nurse to." Midway through his sentence, Yan Qingxi had already ripped off the tape and needle on the back of her hand. Blood rushed out of the open wound. Xiao Su cried out in shock, "Mississippi!" Yan Qingxi just stood up and shrugged. "Let's go." "Okay. Okay." Xiao Su swallowed his protest. He took out 2 sheets of tissues and gave them to Yan Qingxi. "Miss, here, to wipe away the blood." Yan Qingxi pressed the tissues against the foresight. Xiao Su's heart ached as he watched the blood soak through the tissues, and yet, Yan Qingxi's face remained stoic throughout the whole exchange. Yan Qingxi discarded the tissues into the trash can and put on her face mask. She only managed to take a few steps. Yan Qingxi. Someone was calling her name. She turned around and saw the person behind her laughing. What a coincidence. To run into my sister's boyfriend. Oh, you must be here to visit Miss Shui. How is your mistress? Her face healing. Luo Jinchuan looked perfectly healthy. On the other hand, Shui Zheng had been hospitalized a week ago after being assaulted by Yan Mingzhu. Luo Jinchuan was likely here for a visit. Luo Jinchuan slowly stepped forward. He stood in front of Yan Qingxi and said, "Those photos were by you, weren't they? You gave them to Mingzhu and made her think it was Shui Zheng. This was all part of your plan, wasn't it?" Yan Qingxi sized him up as Luo Jinchuan spoke calmly. After Shui Zheng was hospitalized, Yan Mingzhu should be throwing a fit at home, and yet, Luo Jinchuan seemed unaffected. Perhaps it was true that he had no feelings for Yan Mingzhu. This man was not fooling around. Then again, it was Yan Mingzhu who chose him. Yan Qingxi had no intention to hide her involvement. "Yes, it was me. Are you impressed with the photography skills? You looked so dashing in the photos." Her admission did not anger him one bit. Instead, he played along and said, "Not worried that I tell the Yan family that you're back." Yan Qingxi threw out her arms and challenged him. "Up to you. You can tell them the woman in the photo is me. Let them know that you're sleeping with the eldest daughter of the Yan family while hooking up with her sister. If you're shameless enough to admit it, I won't hold you back." Luo Jinchuan might not like Yan Mingzhu, but the man had a reputation to maintain. If it were not for that, Yan Qingxi would not be so daring. Luo Jinchuan regarded Yan Qingxi as a troublemaker and a nuisance, just as she was 3 years ago when they sent her away at the airport. A smile broke across his face and his eyes crinkled devilishly. "You have not changed since 3 years back. Brazen as always." Chapter 93. Think of me constantly. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 93. Think of me constantly. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Yan Qingxi's eyebrow quirked upwards. "Of course I have changed. I have gotten prettier, and definitely more attractive than 3 years back. Or else, why would you be so fascinated by me?" Luo Jinchuan had to concur. True. Fascinating. He knew that Yan Qingxi had set herself up, but still, he did not reveal her homecoming to anyone. He was enthralled by her. These few days had been hell for Luo Jinchuan, all because of the scandal with Shuizheng, and yet, never once had the thought of revealing Yan Qingxi's return crossed his mind. One of the reasons was, as Yan Qingxi had said, he had his reputation to maintain. However, there was another reason: he wanted to see how far she could go. Luo Jinchuan spoke, "Since you have the supporting role in Beauty's Rival in Palace now, play it well. At least Shuizheng wouldn't have got caught in the crossfire for nothing." Despite everything, Luo Jinchuan still felt that it was unfair to Shuizheng. She was the collateral in Yan Qingxi's scheme, she was framed and sabotaged. Yan Qingxi let out a chilling laugh. "TSK, you say it as if you're the one who gave the role to me. That was my role from the get-go. I'm just taking back what's mine, no thanks to you." Shuizheng was caught in the crossfire. "As if you've never slept with her." That elicited an angry stare from Luo Jinchuan. "You. I'm leaving." "Oh, right. Let me advise you, please don't orchestrate another Li Zheng or Wang Zheng or whatever. What's mine, is mine. No one can take that away from me. I'll tear them to shreds." Yan Qingxi growled. Luo Jinchuan's eyes narrowed. This animalistic side of Yan Qingxi had a certain allure that only strengthened his desire to have her. He was completely enraptured by Yan Qingxi. Had they been in somewhere more private, he would have taken her. He watched Yan Qingxi saunter away and spoke casually, "Oh, forgot to let you know. I'm not here for Shuizheng. I'm here for your sister." She slit her wrist. Shuizheng was badly injured by Yan Mingzhu, and Luo Jinchuan had wanted to break up with her after the incident. Yan Mingzhu reacted badly, and in order to scare Luo Jinchuan, she sliced her wrist yesterday. Although she was not truly seeking death, the wound on her wrist was real. The news brought joy to Yan Qingxi. Who knew that this chain reaction would lead to Yan Mingzhu's suicide? No wonder I had a good feeling today. Is she dead? Nope. Tough luck, Yan Qingxi said. She meant what she said. If Yan Mingzhu would just die, there would be one less problem for her. She's in Ward 501, Luo Jinchuan said before leaving. Xiao Shui said, "Miss, let's go." Yan Qingxi remained at her spot. "There's something I need to do first." "What's that?" "Go and get me some sleeping pills from your relative. There was no one in Ward 501 but a patient who appeared to be asleep. Xiao Su gripped Yan Qingxi's arm as she walked forward. His face was pale from fear. "Miss, this isn't good." Yan Qingxi halted her footsteps. "It isn't. Go make some potassium chloride solution." Hearing that, Xiao Su reconsidered. "That. Sleeping pills will be better." Yan Qingxi pushed open the door. On the hospital bed, Yan Mingzhu's complexion was pale and sickly. She was given an intravenous drip on the back of her hand, covered by thick layers of gauze. Yan Qingxi pulled out a hypodermic needle. A cloudy liquid filled the syringe. She had crushed the sleeping pills and dissolved it in a few milliliters of glucose solution. The needle pierced the fore bag and the sleeping pill concoction was administered. Chapter 94. I'm pregnant with your son's child. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 94. I'm pregnant with your son's child. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. The needle pierced the intravenous drip bag and the sleeping pill concoction was administered by Yan Qingxi. Yan Qingxi smiled coldly. "Sleep a while longer, my good sister." She came out of the room and was bombarded by questions from Xiao Su. "Miss, what if something happens? What if people find out?" Yan Qingxi was nonchalant. "Let them find out if they do." Although Yan Qingxi wanted nothing more than the deaths of the whole Yan family, she was not dumb enough to commit murder in broad daylight. She only gave Yan Mingzhu a dosage that will make her sleep for a few days, nothing lethal. The concoction would be delivered slowly into Yan Mingzhu's bloodstream, making it untraceable. There were no surveillance cameras at the door to Ward 501. No one would know. This was just a minor lesson for Yan Mingzhu. The fact that Yan Qingxi did not inject her with AIDS, some sexually transmitted disease, or infectious disease was already her showing mercy. Xiao Su escorted Yan Qingxi to the hospital parking lot, and as fate would have it, they ran into another familiar face. Yan Qingxi locked eyes with the person and both parties were stunned. At first glance, one could tell that they hated each other. Yan Qingxi recovered quickly and put on a smile. What a coincidence. Didn't think I would run into Mrs. Yu here. Mrs. Yu tightened her grip on her handbag and kept a stern face. She asked in a cold tone, "And why are you here?" Looking at this little minx infuriated Mrs. Yu. Yan Qingxi let out a deep sigh and lowered her gaze. With one hand stroking her belly, she said faintly, "You should ask your son. I'm pregnant with your son's child. He doesn't want me to keep it, so I had to abort." Xiao Su's eyes bulged. "Miss, how did gastric become an abortion?" Xiao Su thought to himself. Mrs. Yu's calm composure cracked instantly. Her arrogance and indifference were abandoned. Her eyes widened as she fixed Yan Qingxi with a scrutinizing gaze. Yan Qingxi's face was pale and her body shivered slightly. There was no color in her lips and she looked fragile. Overall, Yan Qingxi had the look of someone who just underwent an abortion. The longer Mrs. Yu looked, the more believable the story was. She pointed a finger at Yan Qingxi. You. Mrs. Yu's self-control was at its limits. If she had met this woman a few days back, she might have been able to carry her grandson 10 months later. Now, not even 1 month in and she had already. Mrs. Yu was starting to feel dizzy. She held on to her car and took 2 deep breaths. "You're lying. How would I know if that's my son's child?" Yan Qingxi laughed bitterly, feigning self-pity, she said, "No point talking about it now. The child is gone. Truly, the Yu family has nothing good. Yu Tingfeng wanted his own child dead. I'll see how fate will treat him." Mrs. Yu felt a stab in her gut. She was mostly convinced by the story, but she had to defend her son. She muttered disgruntledly, "Don't you spout nonsense. My son is not that kind of person." Yan Qingxi pursed her lips and gave her a disdainful look. "Mrs. Yu, you should know how your son is like. Now, he doesn't have a child and you don't have a grandchild. With some rest, I'll be back up on my feet. Marry whoever I want. There's no disadvantage for me." In her next breath, Yan Qingxi said, "Ugh, but pity the child inside me. To be killed by your own father. This blood is on the hands of the Yu family." Chapter 95. Her son was a horrible person. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 95. Her son was a horrible person. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Mrs. Yu felt like there was a knife twisting in her gut. "You. Don't you talk nonsense. Nonsense. Go and ask your own son," Yan Qingxi retorted. Mrs. Yu raised her chin and said, "I will. My son would never have an affair with a minx like you. Don't try to threaten me. I will not stand for it." Yan Qingxi gave a mirthless chuckle. "And yet a minx like me was carrying your unborn grandchild." That made Mrs. Yu's heart ache. She could no longer face Yan Qingxi. She puffed her chest and made a disgruntled noise before walking away. Xiao Su whispered, "Miss, why did you lie to her?" Yan Qingxi replied, "For fun. She's gullible." Yu Tingfeng's mother was such an easier target in comparison. It was obvious how much Mrs. Yu wanted a grandchild. Yan Qingxi only had to make up a simple lie to destabilize the Yu family. "Yu Tingfeng, you made my life difficult. Now, it's my turn." Mrs. Yu rushed to the Department of Gynecology and Obstetrics to find a doctor. A nurse happened to walk out and yelled, "Next, Xin Wei." Mrs. Yu quick went up to the nurse and asked, "Nurse, did a pretty lady come in for a check? Up. She's pregnant. Good. Looking, attractive." The nurse nodded. Yes. The number of young, beautiful ladies that came to their department was pretty high. Mrs. Yu pressed on. And what happened? The nurse's face pinched into a scowl. Ugh, her useless boyfriend made her abort the baby. Men these days are horrible. The nurse had condemned the man twice and Mrs. Yu's blood ran cold. She knew in her heart, her son was a horrible person. Mrs. Yu clutched her chest. Her grandchild. Gone. The nurse watched as Mrs. Yu walked off with a blank stare. She shook her head and muttered to herself, men these days only care about their own pleasure. They don't care about women. Today alone, I already encountered 4 of such incidents. The driver questioned from behind, "Mrs. Yu, do we still need to pay a visit to Superintendent Lee?" Mrs. Yu barked back, "Visit Superintendent Lee. We're going home now." She went to the hospital for a heart check. Up by Superintendent Lee, but her mood had soured. In the car, the more she thought about it, the angrier she was and the harder the loss. That minx was a source of annoyance, but the child was not. By the time she got home, Mrs. Yu was so angry that her head throbbed. With one hand rubbing her temple, she told the housekeeper, "Aunt Wu, call that brat to come home this instant. I need a word with him. That brat. I might die from the anger." Mrs. Yu was usually a mild-tempered person. She did not get angry often as she did not want wrinkles. This was the first time Aunt Wu has seen her this mad. "Mrs. Yu, don't be angry. I will call the young master back now." When Aunt Wu's call came, Yu Ting phone was with Helan Fangyan. Aunt Wu asked, "Young master, did you do something to irritate your mother? She's absolutely livid. She wants you back now." Yu Ting phone was already in a bad mood before the call. He said coldly, "Tell her I'm busy." The moment he finished speaking, the person on the call changed from Aunt Wu to Mrs. Yu. "You come back home now. You better come back this instant or I will drag your corpse back." Chapter 96. Yan Qingxi is pregnant and the child is mine. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 96. Yan Qingxi is pregnant and the child is mine. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. After finishing her sentence, Mrs. Yu hung up the phone. Yu Ting phone was confused. This was the first time his mother was this mad. Usually, the old woman was afraid of him. Yu Ting phone gathered that something was wrong. He said, "I need to head back. Something happened with my mother." Helan Fangyan nodded. "Sure, you go on. This search is not going to happen overnight. You have connections in the country. Just help me pay attention." "No worries." Yu Ting phone left. Once he arrived home, Aunt Wu signaled him in the living room. Yu Ting phone saw his mother sprawled on the couch with an ice pack on her head. Her face was pale. "You wanted me home." In a blink of an eye, Mrs. Yu sat up and threw the ice pack at Yu Ting phone. "You. Do you know what you have done?" Yu Ting phone frowned. "Mom, did you take the wrong medication?" Mrs. Yu was so angry that her chest hurt. "Wrong medication? I swallowed an atomic bomb. Tell me the truth, what did you do today?" "My business is none of your concern," Yu Ting phone answered coolly. "None of my concern? You went to see that little minx, didn't you?" "Who?" Mrs. Yu slammed her palm on the table. "That hussy you ran into last time." The mental image of Yan Qingxi's smile made Yu Ting phone emphasized his indifference. "Oh. Where was that?" Yu Ting phong's nonchalance infuriated Mrs. Yu. "Oh. That's all you can say. In the hospital. Yu Tingfeng looked up. Hospital. Yes, the hospital, you brat. You give me back my grandchild. Mrs. Yu raised her hand and started throwing things at Yu Tingfeng. Yu Tingfeng ducked out of the way. He truly had never seen his mother behaving this crazily. Mom! What nonsense are you talking about? What grandchild? Mrs. Yu pointed a finger at him and her face was white with rage. Still not admitting that minx was pregnant with your child. You made her abort, didn't you? You don't even want your own child. What kind of man are you, Bedodem? This was the angriest Mrs. Yu has ever been at Yu Tingfeng. Yu Tingfeng's head started to ache. He thought for a moment and asked, She told you, she's pregnant. How else would I find out? There was some confusion in his mind. She said. The child is mine. Mrs. Yu smacked Yu Tingfeng a few times as she said, You are still not admitting, aren't you? Are you going to tell me you didn't sleep with her? Yu Tingfeng could not describe his feelings. Mom, don't you hate her? Mrs. Yu's eyes were red and watery. I hate seductresses like her, but she was carrying the legacy of the Yu family. And you just aborted it like it was nothing. You. I want to die. Heh. Yu Tingfeng huffed. Mrs. Yu glared at him. What, heh, dot. Yu Tingfeng gritted his teeth. This woman was creating stories out of nothing. He did not expose Yan Qingxi's lie. He could roughly guess what Yan Qingxi was playing at, mainly to make his life miserable. Yu Tingfeng said to his mother, What's the rush? It's only one baby. I assure you, you will have a lot of grandchildren in the future. You better give me one. Sooner or later. Yu Tingfeng said. Yan Qingxi was quite the woman. Children. Since she returned to the country, he had never even put his dick in her, let alone spread his seeds. How would she even have his child? Chapter 97. Yan Qingxi really was a monster. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 97. Yan Qingxi really was a monster. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Yu Tingfeng asked, Without the child, that woman you hate won't demand for marriage. Isn't that better for us? If she actually came into our family, your life would be quite difficult. Mrs. Yu huffed angrily. Whether my life will be difficult or not is my problem. Don't try to change the topic. You're already in your 30s. Do you think getting a baby is as easy as that? You killed your own child, you better be wary. Yu Tingfeng rubbed his forehead. Mrs. Yu's ranting was giving him a headache. Yan Qingxi really was a monster. Yu Tingfeng got up and said, Ma, I have some business. I'll take my leave. Mrs. Yu yelled from behind, Yu Tingfeng. Don't think you can weasel out of this. Yu Tingfeng took 2 steps and said to his mother, Ma, learn to be less gullible. Mrs. Yu. Who are you calling gullible? Stop right there. Yu Tingfeng dialed for Jiang Lai. Jiang Lai, help me investigate why Yan Qingxi was in the hospital today. Disgust simmered in his heart even though he was inclined to believe that Yan Qingxi was only trying to complicate his life. However, what if she really was pregnant? Yu Tingfeng had the urge to find Yan Qingxi and make her clarify the situation, but he controlled himself. The truth was revealed to him the next day in his office. Jiang Lai handed Yu Tingfeng the dossier. CEO Yan Qingxi went to the hospital yesterday for gastric pains. She was prescribed a drip. Also, these are the information covering the 3 years when she was abroad. She moved a lot in country M, so it took some time to gather the info. And it's not 100% complete. Learning about the gastric pain made the tightness in Yu Tingfeng's chest disappear. As long as it was not an abortion. From the thickness of the binder, Yu Tingfeng was surprised that it was an incomplete file. "You're dismissed," Yu Tingfeng said. The amount of information could fill a book. At the start, Yu Tingfeng was only flipping impassionately through the pages, but his mood deteriorated as he went on. His hands were trembling slightly when he was done. In the 3 years abroad, Yan Qingxi's life consisted of only two things: work and escape. The Yan family had continued to pursue her while she was away. Sabotage, setup, assault, assassination. At one point, Yan Qingxi was on the streets, homeless, hungry, and freezing. She was sick to the point of almost dying, yet no one gave her a helping hand or warmth. No one offered her shelter from the wind and rain. She was alone in a faraway land, neglected by the society's uncaring attitude. Adding to that, her own family was constantly threatening her safety. Yan Qingxi was like a wild animal trapped in a cage, bleeding but still fighting. Sometimes, a woman's beauty is a curse. In the current society, the prettier a woman was, the harder life was on her. No one knew of the hard parts of Yan Qingxi's life, just like no one knew how much she had suffered. Yu Tingfeng was unclear as to what happened in the past. Why was there such a deep hatred between the Yan family and Yan Qingxi to the point of plotting murder? Years ago, Yu Tingfeng never paid attention to the intricacies of the Yan family dynamics. He only knew that Yan Qingxi hated the family, likely because of the incident with her mother. He did not care to press for any details when he unintentionally botched Yan Rook's plan for Yan Qingxi. Chapter 98. The realization made Yu Tingfeng afraid. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 98. The realization made Yu Tingfeng afraid. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. At that time, Yu Tingfeng felt that the issue was unrelated to him. He did not care about Yan Qingxi, so why waste his time and effort? Then, Yan Qingxi left. Yan Qingxi occupied his mind for a few days after her departure. In the end, he concluded that it was a one-night stand with a somewhat interesting woman. There was no need for him to keep tabs on her. During the years, Yu Tingfeng had gone to Country M for business and pleasure every year, but never once did he thought of visiting Yan Qingxi. He stayed in a 5-star hotel, enjoying the haute cuisine served. Meanwhile, Yan Qingxi was starving with no food to eat. Yu Tingfeng's grip tightened around the files in his hands. There was a photo of Yan Qingxi on a snow-covered street. Her clothes looked to be threadbare as she walked through the street, her face showed signs of assault. Her eyes were colder than the falling snow. For a moment, Yu Tingfeng was at a loss. His perception of Yan Qingxi was muddled. He recognized, for the first time in his life, that he might have made a mistake. Yu Tingfeng, you best pray you never fall in love with me, or else. The voice of Yan Qingxi echoed in his ears. Her voice was weak and composed, but the hatred struck fear into his heart. Yu Tingfeng rubbed his eyes. The files spilled onto his feet and scattered all over the floor. Yu Tingfeng never had much sympathy for others. What Yan Qingxi went through was not even the worst thing he had seen before. Yet, the thought of Yan Qingxi being persecuted made Yu Tingfeng's heart panic. He had never felt this way before. Yu Tingfeng's car was parked in front of Yan Qingxi's apartment for 3 to 4 hours. When he finally got out of the car, he spent another hour outside of Yan Qingxi's door without ringing the bell. Yu Tingfeng realized that he was afraid. He did not know how he should approach Yan Qingxi. Envied that he found himself laughing. In his entire life, fear was never something he expected to feel. Yu Tingfeng got home at 10 o'clock at night. Mrs. Yu was in the living room watching a television drama with a mask on. It was her favorite Chinese historical drama. She never missed an episode, even if it meant staying up. Mrs. Yu rolled her eyes at her son and ignored him. Usually, she would ask him if he had taken dinner and if he wanted supper. Now, she was still angry. Yu Tingfeng had nothing to say, so he went upstairs. A thought crossed his mind and he stopped. Ma, if you did something wrong to a person, normally, how do you apologize? The shock on Mrs. Yu's face was evident even through the mask. This was the first time her son had asked such a question. Even her television drama was abandoned. There was a long pause before she answered, apologize. Son, are you all right? Are you feeling well? Do you have a fever? Oh, I know, have you found your conscience and realized that aborting your baby was a mistake? Yu Tingfeng's face darkened at his mother's response. I'm going to bed. He left Mrs. Yu with a dumbfounded look on her face. Tingfeng thinks that he did something wrong. Has he finally realized that he shouldn't be acting like a scoundrel? Mrs. Yu thought. Mrs. Yu felt that she was on the right track. Maybe, a grandchild was not a far-fetched dream after all. Yu Tingfeng could not sleep that night. Chapter 99. She was determined to get him. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 99. She was determined to get him. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. The week went by quietly for Yan Qingxi, allowing her to recharge. The Yan family was in a chaotic state, with Yan Mingzhu unconscious for days and Yan Mingxiu's hopeless condition. Luo Jinchuan also did not stir up any trouble for Yan Qingxi. Same went for Yu Tingfeng. After that day, Yan Qingxi had not seen him around. After being back in the country for a month, Yan Qingxi could finally rest for a few days. She still wanted revenge on Yu Tingfeng, but she knew there was no rush. She had to mull over her plans. Yu Tingfeng was not a target she could just let go of. She was determined to get him. The best way to get revenge on a man is to make him fall deeply in love with you. Then, you will have everything. Yan Qingxi would not make the first move. She waited patiently for him. Her tip for picking up guys was to never let them know that you are actually interested. Yan Qingxi joined the cast and crew of Requiem for a few days of shooting. She was slowly getting familiar with director Kai. Everyone assumed that Yan Qingxi was close to Yu Tingfeng and treated her exceptionally well. After 5 days of shooting, the crew of Beauty's Rival in Palace called her to inform her about the schedule. She was asked to go to Jing City for her scenes. As she was packing her things at home, Miss Mai received calls from 2 producers who enjoyed a certain degree of fame in the entertainment industry. They told Miss Mai that they wanted Yan Qingxi in their movies as the lead actress. The directors said that if there are schedule clashes, they would accommodate Yan Qingxi regardless of the wait time. Such privileges did not apply even to A-list celebrities. The news did not brighten Miss Mai's mood. She hung up the calls and asked Yan Qingxi, suddenly we have 2 big movie productions calling. They're both under the Yu clan. I assume this has to do with Yu Tingfeng. Possibly. Yan Qingxi nodded. Do you want to go? Miss Mai asked. Yan Qingxi grinned. Taking a deep breath, she said, sure. Why wouldn't I? I'm a WH*re in his eyes. Of course I'm going to show up. I'm reaping what I sow, plus, this is his repayment for the debt. Yan Qingxi believed that she no longer had any dignity in Yu Tingfeng's eyes. There was no point in acting coy now. Getting the role was the main priority. The food has to be eaten in order for the stomach to feel full. Yan Qingxi understood that more than anyone else. Miss Mai patted her shoulders and said, one day, you will stand on the highest stage and be crowned Best Actress. That I do not doubt. Yan Qingxi smiled. The day will come. Revenge was not the only thing she wanted, success was the other. Miss Mai said, I have decided to sign Ling Ran. The boy's not bad. Look out for him. Yan Qingxi nodded. Sure. Ling Ran was the young, handsome lad that acted alongside Yan Qingxi as the male lead. He was polite and had an air of elegance. He was a bashful guy who blushed whenever he saw Yan Qingxi. She could not hate the child. Miss My thought of something else. Right, King Jin's MV might not go through. Why? Yan Qingxi frowned. Miss Mai spoke hesitantly, the two music companies backing him are being bought over by the Yu clan. Yan Qingxi was silent. After a while, she continued packing her clothes. I understand. No wonder the music video shooting got interrupted midway. This explained the inactivity for the next 2 days. Yan Qingxi smiled. Chapter 100. Why? Do you miss me? You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 100. Why? Do you miss me? Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Yan Qingxi smiled. She did not expect Yu Tingfeng to make such a move. Her ego was soothed. To think that the young master of the Yu family would step in for her. The edges of her mouth twitched. It seemed like her chances of getting Yu Tingfeng had jumped by a significant amount. Yan Qingxi stared at Yu Tingfeng's number on her phone. Should she call? Was Jin Xuechu worth her disturbing Yu Tingfeng? If she called Yu Tingfeng now, she would be going against her own advice. What she would say did not matter, what mattered was the fact that she caved and called first. 10 minutes later, she decided to delay her trip to Jing City by a day. She phoned for Jin Xuechu. Shui God, do you have time today? Why? Want a date with me? Jin Xuechu's mouth was despicable as always. His voice was relaxed and did not indicate that he was in a tight spot. Yeah, so are you free? Yan Qingxi raised an eyebrow. Jin Xuechu spoke in an excited tone. Well, I only date pretty girls for sex. Other than that, I'm not really interested. So, what do you want from me? His tone was light as if joking. Yan Qingxi smiled. Then I'm sorry to disappoint. I'm asking you out for a music video shoot. A moment passed before Jin Xuechu recovered from the shock. There are some complications with my album. We may have some delays, so the MV. Jin Xuechu had yet to finish his explanation when Yan Qingxi cut in. Don't talk to me about the maybes. I'll have you know that I will get back whatever that has been stolen from me. I will not let this slide. If you're a man, don't go back on your word. Yan Qingxi's words shocked Jin Xuechu to his core. No one had ever given him such a speech before. Suddenly, the passion that had been long since dormant in his heart ignited. Even if we wanted to shoot, we don't have a studio, he said gingerly. We don't need a studio. Tell your assistant to get a camera. Okay. Jin Xuechu did not ask more questions. The record companies had been taken over by the Yu Clan Financial Group. They had no firepower to fight against the acquisition, and immediately after the deal was done, Jin Xuechu's album was placed on hiatus. At this point, there was not much to care about anymore. They reached the destination. It was an old junkyard that had mountains and mountains of abandoned cars. The wreckage was depressing and the air was heavy with the smell of scrap metal. A feeling of melancholy permeated through the site. Jin Xuechu's manager, Tony, pinched his nose and cried, "Why are we here? Filthy, just filthy." With one hand pinching his nose, he pointed at Yan Qingxi and shouted, "What are we supposed to film here? There's only us." Yan Qingxi ignored him and said to Jin Xuechu, "Follow me." From her previous experience of working in film abroad, she had picked up some videography skills. She was never one to give up. If there was no studio, she would find herself a set. If there was no cameraman, she would be one. It was just a music video and she had faith that they could make one. Jin Xuechu was a talented genius. Once he saw the junkyard, he felt his heart beat passionately. He understood instantly that the setting captured the soul of his album's main track. He hooked an arm around Yan Qingxi's neck and said, thank you. You're a genius, and if it weren't for the fact that we're of the same breed, I really would like a chance with you.